With less than a month until the midterm elections, the race for Georgia's governorship is a toss-up. With us now from Atlanta, the Democrat in that race, Stacey Abrams. She's deadlocked with the Republican nominee, two-term Georgia Secretary of State, Brian Kemp. And thanks so much for being with us, Stacey. I want to start with a story that the Associated Press broke yesterday and ask you what you can tell us about it. The AP said that your opponent, who again is Secretary of State in charge of registration and voting, said that he's suggesting that he's using his position to suppress voters. Up to 55,000 people who have registered to vote, and 70% of those are black voters, and they may not even know that he's trying to suppress their voter registration. What can you tell us about that, and what can be done to count every vote?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this morning. The challenge is this process called exact match, and we've been fighting him on this since 2014. What happens is if you have a hyphen in your last name, if you have a difficult spelling, if anyone misspells or leaves out anything, they can use that as basically as a reason to not process your registration. And that means that about 53,000 Georgians currently have their registrations in pending status. Technically, they can cast provisional ballots, but provisional ballots are often not processed. And so we're deeply worried that 53,000 people, 70% of whom are African American, will be disenfranchised in this election.
And you also say that of those people, again, let's state it again, 7 in 10 of the voters are black voters in Georgia.
Exactly.
Some of them, many of them, may not even know, according to the Associated Press, that their registration has been held up.
Part of the problem with exact match is that you don't know what the problem is. So if you resubmit the exact same information, but the registrar drops the hyphen or transposes a letter in your name, you don't know that that's the reason that you weren't processed. Number one, you may not get the information. Number two, if you return the same information you submitted the first time, the same mistake can happen. But what we want people to understand is we're fighting this. There are organizations across the state that are fighting this, but we still can get our votes out. We need people to understand that we've got 1.5 million eligible voters who are on the rolls, who do not vote in midterms. And if they will stand up and speak for those 53,000, we can still make a difference in this election.
Stacey, it's Willie Geist. It's great to meet you and have you on the show this morning.
You as well.
I want to ask you about your path to the governor's mansion here. That's a state in Georgia that's long been considered red. President Trump, though, only won by 5 points in 2016. The non-white population just in the last 28 or 30 years has grown from 29 to 40% in the state of Georgia. How do you build a coalition? Who's it composed of to win the election?
We're going after every single voter because what we learned from past elections is that we can't cherry pick our voters. Our voters pick us. And so I'm talking about the issues that matter. I'm talking about health care. I'm talking about creating good jobs everywhere. I'm talking about education. But we are not trying to find one single group of voters. What we are trying to do is activate voters who normally don't think their voices matter. You were speaking earlier about the kitchen table issues, and what we find is that regardless of your demography, every Georgian wants a good job, they want to make sure their kids are taken care of, and they want access to health care for themselves and their families. I'm the only candidate with comprehensive plans, and what we have found is that I've won every demographic in our primary. I won across the state of Georgia, including the county of Forsyth, which in years past had gotten a bit of a reputation. Because what people have found is that my voice and their values match. And that's how we can win this election, by talking about the issues that matter to them, not talking about what matters to me.
And what did you learn, Stacey, from Doug Jones's victory next door in Alabama last year, other than it's nice to run against one of the worst political candidates in the history of American politics? What do you take away from his win?
Number one, he went everywhere, and that's what we've done in the state of Georgia. I've been to all 159 counties. We have basically one county per person in Georgia. Number two, I've done the hard work of actually going into these neighborhoods and knocking on those doors. We have fielded a program, an organizer program, that's going to knock nearly 3 million doors in this election. And number three, what we learned is that values matter. that Doug Jones didn't just talk about his record, he talked about how that record would lead him to act in the Senate. I talk about how my record of working across the aisle means that I can work with a Republican legislature, but that my leadership as Democratic head of the caucus means that I can fight for our values and hold the line on the issues that matter. And that's what voters are looking for. They want to know that they've got a fighter, but someone who can work with everyone to get good done. And that's been my reputation for 11 years on both sides of the aisle.
Stacey, Rick Tyler, as Willie was mentioned since 1978 when Newt Gingrich won Congress, won his first seat in Congress, the state had steadily turned red, and it's been a solid Republican state. And I realize you're going out and you're talking to all these voters. What is specifically is the impact of Donald Trump on this race? What are you hearing from voters? And if they are supportive of Donald Trump, how are you winning those voters over?
I think that what we have found is that his presidency has generated an energy and an enthusiasm among a lot of voters. People who didn't think that voting mattered remember November 2016, and they realize, yes, their voices do need to be heard. And so it's less about his direct issues and much more about the atmosphere that he's created. But I will say on the issues of tariffs, on trying to eliminate coverage for pre-existing conditions, and having a candidate on the opposite side who supports those positions, that's really helped energize voters who realize that if you're a farmer down in South Georgia, there's a tax on you now, a tax that's being put in place by the Republican leadership in Washington. That if you want to cover your pre-existing condition because you're a two-time breast cancer survivor, that I'm the only candidate who's pushing for Medicaid expansion and protecting your right to health care, and that my opponent actually voted against covering pre-existing conditions. And so what we're finding is that there is a narrative being set out of D.C., but these are Georgia voters with Georgia values of family and faith and service and responsibility, and they want the ability to take care of themselves, and I'm the only candidate who's really speaking to those issues.
Heidi?
Stacey, you are in a dead heat there in the race, and the person who is holding back these voter registrations is your opponent, Secretary of State Kemp, and he's holding them back on the pretense that there may be voter fraud. In 2016, the Washington Post did a exhaustive research piece that found only 4 cases nationwide of alleged voter fraud. And here you have in the state of Georgia alone, 53,000 people potentially whose votes may not be counted or are at risk of not being counted. What is the recourse? Is this just going to be accepted that we're going into this razor-tight election and that these people's votes may not be counted? Or is there some kind of recourse between now and then?
So I want to emphasize 3 things. One, yes, the 53,000 are being held in pending status. This isn't the first time he's done this. We actually took him to court. I did, through my organization, the New Georgia Project, in coalition with other groups, and we sued him 4 years ago for this issue. It took us a few years, but we actually got a federal court to force him to restore 33,000 illegally canceled registrations. They then came back and passed legislation to say he could do it again, and we're going to fight him again. And so the court battle will continue. But I want people to understand that voter suppression has 2 effects. One is to stop people from voting, but the other is to scare people out of voting. And I do not want them to have the effect on either side. We have enough registered voters in Georgia to win this election. As you talked about earlier, millions of people stayed home across this country in 2016, and in Georgia it was nearly 750,000. But we've added new voter registrants. In fact, 250,000 new registrants are on the rolls being processed right now. I want them to recognize that their voices can be the amplification of those who've been told they can't vote. So I don't want us to get scared away from voting, and that's the recourse. One is that we'll fight the legal battle, but we need every Georgia voter of good conscience to step up and vote for those who've been told they cannot vote.
Stacey Abrams in an airtight race in her bid to become the first female African-American governor in the history of this country. Stacey, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, the Dow Jones took a sharp drop yesterday, thanks in large part to a massive sell-off in tech stock. But there were some other factors at play as well, and Steve Ratner will break those down for us next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.